the largest and most broadly supported public policy research organization in the country. To give you but one example of its influence, for 20 years, the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University held an orientation for newly elected members of Congress. This year, they canceled their orientation session for lack of interest because Ed Feulner and the Heritage Foundation was holding a competing orientation for newly elected members in Annapolis. And that just gives you one little indication of how the power curve has changed and how the Heritage Foundation is in fact at the forefront of public policy debate in this country and before Congress. Hardly a day goes by where I don't see some reference in the newspaper, in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Atlanta, Constitution, or what have you, where the Heritage Foundation does not have some expert on some subject or another testifying before the new Congress. It's almost as if Ed's staff now is working part-time for him and part-time for us taxpayers on the Hill. But I think that's a very promising and very encouraging sign to see that the United States Congress is now taking its cues and taking its policy input from organizations like the Heritage Foundation. I'd like to close by saying something on a personal note or a professional note from the Georgia Public Policy Foundation's perspective. We depend tremendously on the resources and the persons and the experts at the Heritage Foundation. All state policy organizations like the Georgia Public Policy Foundation do so. So they're absolutely critical to the information and the expertise that we can make available through our publications and bring into the public policy arena in Georgia. And we are tremendously indebted to Heritage and to Ed Feulner for those services he provides. So without further ado, let me introduce to you as a personal honor, Ed Feulner.
Playing a disappearing role down here for a minute. Let's see. Looking for one of my props. Well, guess I'll do without it. Thanks, Griff. I am really delighted to be here, to be able both to meet with some old friends and also to congratulate you and your colleagues, because it is a joy to work with you and your colleagues here. I know Tom Atwood, one of my colleagues at Heritage, who serves with you on StateNet, the network of state think tanks around the country, is particularly keen on working with our good friends in Georgia, which has become really a model of state think tanks around the country. It's particularly good to be back in Atlanta, where despite the fact I was born and raised in Chicago, I feel I have roots, and I have roots because of two men who are here today. One of them, Ed Noble, is in many respects responsible for me being in Washington, because it was Ed Noble in 1963, remember back that far, who started the Public Affairs Fellowship Program with Dick Allen at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And in 1965, I was the first one of those. And through the Noble Foundation, that program has continued and prospered out at the Hoover Institution. And I'm very, very proud to have had that honor back then. And it's really what got me started in the Washington public policy community. So, Ed, I salute you. And I particularly salute you for your bride, Maria, and particularly because it's eased a lot of our minds, because one of the first things Maria has managed to do to Ed is make sure that he arrives at the airport on time for airplanes, so that in fact we know Ed will show up, right? And to both of them, I apologize a little bit in advance, because they're going to hear the same, basically the same set of remarks Friday evening in Phoenix when we're all together out there, which I know Linda looks forward to. The other person who's here who needs a special note of introduction is the man who did, in fact, directly put me where I am now, because at the time he was chairman of the board of the Heritage Foundation, and that's Ben Blackburn. And Ben, I don't think either of us, back when we were involved in the Republican Study Committee or later at Heritage, could have envisioned exactly where Heritage has gone or where the Congress has gone. So it's really an exciting time. Thank you, my friend, and best to Mary. I've been for years, one of my standing lines of introduction to a speech has been that the two biggest lies in the world are the checks in the mail and I'm from Washington, I'm here to help you. Well, at this stage of the game, the new introductory line, at least for the rest of this month, has to be as the Heritage Foundation 1995 calendar would say, Happy Newt Year, because it was not by accident, I guess, that Newt's picture, even though we printed these calendars in mid-October, that Newt's picture was in there early, because he was, in fact, holding Issues 94, which we think had a major role to play in terms of both setting the agenda for the 1994 elections and now, hopefully, in terms of keeping the members focused on what they should be doing. What I want to do today is four things. First, remind you what really happened in November. Second, tell you just very briefly what we at Heritage had to do with it. Thirdly, discuss briefly what's going to happen. And fourth, as a good conservative and a Catholic who believes in original sin, tell you what we have to worry about for the next couple of years. So, first, what really happened. The first thing to bear in mind is don't let the liberal media establishment rewrite the history of the 1994 election. It was not disenchantment with the Washington policy structure or the permanent government or the whole of the Congress. Remember, not a single incumbent Republican who ran for re-election to the House of Representatives, to the United States Senate, or as a governor lost. Not a single one. Secondly, it was not some white male thing because they voted disproportionately for the Republican candidates and because there was such a low turnout, therefore, et cetera, that's what really happened. Quite the contrary. In fact, it was the highest off-year turnout in the last four off-year elections in 12 years. So you can't do that. Thirdly, it was not Peter Jennings, 2-year-old, throwing a tantrum when they went into the voting booths around the country on November 8th. And finally, and the most bizarre explanation of all, was one Leon Panetta tried in mid-December on one of the Sunday talk shows when he said that what really caused people to vote the way they did was when Ronald Reagan, the Friday before the election, admitted that he had Alzheimer's and therefore it was really a sympathy vote for Ronald Reagan. Now that one, this is how, he said, in fact, published in all the major newspapers, he said that he couldn't think of what else it could have been. Well, that said a lot to those of us who believe that ideas matter and that this really was an idea-laden campaign and that Gingrich et al. Helped define it in terms of what the issues were and how they worked. It was, in fact, we believe, 1994, was a national referendum on the contract with America. It was something that was nationalized when Newt stood up there with those 300-plus Republicans, both candidates and incumbents, on the steps of the Capitol and signed the pledge that this was not just another campaign promise, but that this was a pledge with the voters that, in fact, there were going to be votes taken on these matters and that it would happen. So it was very, very different. And, of course, that was ratified during the course of the next 7 weeks when the President of the United States, thinking that he was going to politically help himself, ran against the contract and pointed out all the so-called disadvantages that it would have to the American people. So, in fact, they helped nationalize the whole election. It was, in fact, I believe, very much a continuation of the Reagan Revolution of 1980. It was which had been unfortunately interrupted, and but it was a reaffirmation that what Reagan had run on and campaigned on and what he had actually tried to implement in terms of his presidency really still had validity. Again, this was confirmed because the president himself ran against the 1980s, ran against the Reagan agenda, and he, Clinton, was repudiated. And finally, it was new politics. And again, I come back to the idea that contract is a pledge. It was new politics because Gingrich, in a little noted press response before he was Speaker, when he was still Speaker-elect, or whatever the official title is, was asked right after the GATT vote in late November, number one, why he voted the way he did, and why he voted and why he let the vote go on when it happened. He said, well, the first part of the answer to that question is very easy. I voted in favor of GATT because I think it's in the interest of the people of my district and the people of America. He said, but the second part, and he urged the press to pay special attention to this. Of course, they didn't. But he urged them to listen carefully to what he was going to say. He said, we had the vote now. He said, yes, I could have probably delayed it until the new Congress, where we could have embarrassed the president, or we could have changed it, or whatever. He said, but we had the vote now because 6 weeks ago, I gave the president my word that we would have the vote in the House during this lame duck session. And I want you and the media, and I want the American people to know that I'm a politician who's going to live up to my word. And, you know, as a precursor to Monday's earthquake in Japan, the walls in Washington started to shake and rumble because the Washington news media is not used to being told by politicians to go back and check on their promises, and that they will, in fact, live up to their word. So anyway, that's what happened in November. Now, as somebody involved in the public policy process, the second point I wanted to make was what heritage had to do with it. Just a few anecdotes, but I do think every once in a while it's good for us to take a step back, to gloat a little bit, to celebrate the victories when we have victories. Because in the public policy process, it's a continuing string of battles in kind of a never-ending war. It's never really over, because you're always going to go back and fight the same thing time after time, and things have changed in those 7 years since I was down in Thomasville. But still, there are many things the same. But let me gloat for just a minute. Newt was holding up this Issues 94, which I already said really helped define what the agenda was. A couple quick examples. Bill Frist, the newly elected senator from the state of Tennessee, when asked by one of the Tennessee newspapers what his position was on housing policy, opened up our Issues 94 Xerox 2 pages of it and faxed it to that particular reporter. And on the number of testimonials we had from the newly elected members of both the House and the Senate in terms of how that particular document, not only in terms of anticipating the challenges from their liberal opponents and or media questions, also in terms of how to phrase answers to questions, what hot buttons to avoid, and how to basically deal with the news media, was kind of an issues-oriented Bible, really, for the campaign. Secondly, during the course of a normal year, Heritage will produce somewhere around 225 short backgrounders, issue updates, briefing papers of one kind or another. We'll have 300 or so meetings, conferences, roundtables, panel discussions, working groups, and all the rest, in covering the whole range of domestic and foreign policy issues from the conservative viewpoint. And that information, again, together with the incredibly dedicated work of our staff people, for example, working behind the scenes and in a low-key way with Dick Armey, with Newt's staff, and with others during the course of the last year in terms of fleshing out the contract with America. Every single one of the congressional reform provisions of the contract with America were in our 1993 book on reforming the Congress. In addition, one of the things that we try to work very closely with Griff and others at our friends at the 30-some state public policy groups is our state backgrounders, trying to take what we're doing at the federal level, making it relevant specifically to the states. Again, what are we trying to do with all this? We're trying to change the Washington agenda, move it in a more conservative direction, to remind people that it's basically free men working through free markets with a strong national defense and based on traditional American values that really can make a difference, and that really is what the United States is built upon. That ideas really matter. We are conservative. We are not partisan Republicans. It just so happens that the overwhelming number of conservatives are in one political party, but we'll work with anybody in either political party whenever we get the chance. But we are unashamedly and unabashedly conservative, and we were conservative when that was not very popular. In fact, one of the interesting sidelights there in terms of how what happened in November is really changing the whole Washington power structure. Twice now in the New York Times in the last 2 weeks, I have seen them actually refer to left-wing liberals. Now, Matt, can you remember the time when the New York Times ever admitted anybody was a left-wing liberal? It happened to be Jesse Jackson, and they actually, we're all right-wingers, of course, by definition, but to actually call a Democrat a left-wing was really quite phenomenal. So things are changing in Washington and in the country. But what we try to do at Heritage is challenge the conventional wisdom and, again, move the debate in terms of what the relationship between the individual and his government should be. Some quick examples. Some of you may have caught on C-SPAN, one of my favorite little incidents. Harold Ford, the then chairman, now ranking Democratic member on the Ways and Means Subcommittee on welfare reform, publicly chastising my colleague Robert Rector last year, saying that in fact he wasn't going to listen to Rector because Rector's testimony on welfare reform, which was the subject at hand, was not really on the subject, and besides that, Rector really was getting a subsidy from the United States government because he worked for the Heritage Foundation, which after all is a tax-deductible organization. Rector was simply trying to point out that if you look at welfare, you can't just look at AFDC. You had to look at all 76 different federal programs totaling $375 billion a year, and that's not what Harold Ford wanted to hear. Or what my young colleague Scott Hodge did with the crime bill, where he was the one who really went through the bill line by line, pointed out that it was not 100,000 police, that it was 20,000 police for 1 year times 5 years. Now, yes, 20,000 times 5 does add up to 100,000, but that does not mean that the federal government was going to put 100,000 police on the street. It meant they were going to do it 5 times, and they were going to do 20,000 each time. And that it was not really a crime bill anyway, it was really a pork bill. And what we did there was we not only analyzed the impact of the bill nationwide, but we did it congressional district by congressional district and state by state in order to make it more useful to our friends and colleagues on the Hill. And finally, moving into your area, Mac, it was us really more than a year ago, John Luddy and Baker Spring, who came out and started talking about hollow forces and how our military was grossly unprepared. Now, you may have noted 2 weeks before the election that the Deputy Secretary of Defense came out, denied this in congressional hearings and at a press conference, and it was only 10 days after the election that he had to come out and admit that in fact he had misspoke, that there were 2 of the 10 Army divisions that were not combat ready at the time that he had spoken, and that he had unfortunately been misinformed. I'm sure it had nothing to do with the time of year that happened or the fact that there was an election in between. Health care, a subject where we were intimately involved, producing more than 50-some papers, countless conferences, our physicians forum chaired by our chairman of the board, Dr. David Brown, and a whole host of activities in that area, redefining again what a sensible health care plan would be along the lines of the Don Nichols, Cliff Stearns bill. It is, in fact, a new environment in Washington right now. We're involved right now in terms of redefining new roles. Where we have a whole series of new publications just coming out. The Index of Economic Freedom was published 10 days ago. What it does is talk about what countries are free around the world, what economic assistance, foreign aid, if you will, has done to or for those countries, and why, in fact, we should not be giving foreign aid to those countries that are just going to squander it on parastatals or lining the pockets of their own rulers. This has created quite a stir. The administrator of AID in Washington has already taken 2 separate speeches to reply in great detail to our critique, probably because Senator Mitch McConnell, the new chairman of the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee involved in this question, has taken the Index of Economic Freedom and is going to use that as his framework in terms of how he redefines what the aid program is all about. We have a whole host of other programs and policies coming out, too, in terms of defining what ought to happen after the first 100 days, but maybe that's more appropriate to another speech on another occasion. Suffice it to say that at the moment it's very exciting to have visitors like backbencher Bob Livingston, all of a sudden the new chairman of the House Appropriations Committee, coming over and saying in his very low-key, understated way that yes, he really does favor the line item veto. In fact, in a way, Ed, you could say, I've got a line item veto. I just take out my pen and I go 0 next to that line. And I'd much rather it be Bob Livingston, I'll tell you, having that line item veto at the moment than certain other politicians in Washington. Similarly, we're active on a whole host of other issues, and also in terms of redefining again what the political mainstream is in the United States, that it really is fundamentally conservative, limited government, to the point where, for example, tomorrow my luncheon will be with the editors of Business Week, who are coming down to Washington to spend the whole day with us to find out how we work and what we're all about. So a few words now about what's going to happen in the near future. January 4th, we saw more changes in the one day in the way Congress works than we have seen really in the last 40 years. Again, those changes were included in our ruling class volume that we published and produced more than 1 million copies of and widely circulated around the country about a year to anywhere from a year to 6 months or 8 months ago. Again, the significant thing is that the newly elected majority in the House and in the Senate are doing what they promised they were going to do. Just last night, when I arrived back in the country, the Congressional Accountability Act, in terms of putting the Congress under all the same laws that you and I as average citizens have to live under, had been passed by both houses and is now on the President's desk waiting his signature, the first part of the contract that will be signed into law by the President. Balanced budget amendment be coming up later this month. I'm convinced that it will be up. I'm not sure whether they're going to be able to hold the 3/5 majority required for a tax cut. I think they will in the House, possibly not in the Senate. In either case, I think the balanced budget amendment is important and significant, because what it is, it's going to in effect impose an external framework on the Congress so that in the future, every time a new program comes up for authorization or an old one comes up for reauthorization, the fundamental question will have to be, should we continue this or should we start this, and how does this affect everything else in terms of reaching that objective of a balanced budget by the year 2002 or whatever it is. In effect, it's a much needed kind of chainsaw as opposed to scalpel type approach to government, which I think again is something that the country is looking for and that we really need. Federal mandate prohibitions. Just 7 days after the election, we were pleased to host California Governor Pete Wilson at Heritage when he gave his first post-election speech on the whole question of federal mandates, what it was costing the state of California, and how, in fact, it might concretely be reformed. And I think, again, there you're going to see some very quick action on it. In effect, a basic redefinition of the relationship between the citizen and the government, and a redefinition of the states to the federal government. And again, that's why what you're doing here in terms of supporting the Georgia Public Policy Forum is so very, very important. What are we going to be worried about in the immediate future? Again, we wouldn't really be conservatives if we didn't have something to worry about. I'm reminded of an old conservative ally in Washington, Howie Phillips, who on November 18th, 1980, called me to tell me that Ronald Reagan had already sold out and the whole battle wasn't worth it and it was over. Now this, mind you, was 2 months before Ronald Reagan was even inaugurated. So some conservatives, I'd have to say, tend to be a little bit paranoid, but in fact we do have things we have to worry about. I've listed 4 things that I worry about in terms of the Speaker. First thing, and I've said these to him privately, so it's not any big expose or anything, but since we are among friends, I'll do it as if I were talking to each of you individually, is occasional tendency to shoot from the hip or shoot from the lip, as somebody said. It reminds me when our board was in Moscow in early November, we went to the Moscow Circus, and the main juggler in the Moscow Circus at one time must have had, I don't know, 17 or 18 balls up in the air, and I kept saying to Linda, I said, you know, one of those things is going to come crashing down somewhere. Well, that's, I guess, kind of what Gingrich is at the moment. He's got so many balls in the air that the occasional book deal or the historian or whatever, when you're making that many decisions, you are going to have some of them come crashing down. I think as he gets into the swing of things, as his hopefully staff learns what kinds of checking they've got to do before either announcements are made or before things become public, that he can avoid them a little bit better in the future because they're distractions. Yes, he's very good in terms of realizing if he's made a mistake, he backs off, apologizes, gets on with the job. The problem is, of course, the media is out to do everything they can to embarrass him, to embarrass the ideas he represents, and as I say, it is a distraction from what the main event is about. So we've got to, he's got to watch and worry about that. Second thing, and this is not so much internal to Newt, it's the way the system works, is going to be pressures from the left. The pressures from the left are inexorable. They're not only from the White House, they're not only from the Democrats, who still have yet to realize that they're in the minority and that they have to learn how to act like the minority. It's also from the national news media, and it's from the whole host of pressure groups, including those hundreds of pressure groups on the outside that have been funded by our taxpayer dollars for so long, who can perhaps now all of a sudden see an end to the free gravy train coming. And those pressures are there, and the reason I say Newt has to worry about it is because I think it's more important than ever for those of us both on the outside as well as his colleagues inside the Congress to keep counter pressures on him from our side of the fence, to remind him why he's there, to remind him that this is what real America thinks and which direction he should be moving in. The third one, of course, is within his own party, and that's the fuzzy thinking of some of the liberals, the Mark Hatfields of the world, who's already not only denounced the contract, but saying as Appropriations Committee chairman in the Senate he doesn't intend to go along with these notions of cutting and slashing. That obviously the Senate is a different kind of place than the House is in terms of what kind of teamwork can be expected. But again, the Gingriches and the Doles have to remember who's the dog and who's the tail, and not let the tail wag the dog too often. The fourth thing that I think all of us have to worry about and have to be very cautious in terms of our presentations publicly and privately, and that is this notion that somehow Newt Gingrich is now Prime Minister and Bill Clinton is the king, and he just goes out to do ceremonial things out in California to celebrate earthquake anniversaries or dedicate hospitals or whatever. That ain't the way our system works, and we don't want to be in a position of portraying it that way. Clinton not only still has the veto pen, he also has the incredible power of the presidential bully pulpit. There's only one foreign policy. He's the one who speaks on foreign policy. We can criticize, we can urge adaptation and changes to that foreign policy, but he's the only one who represents the United States at summit meetings. So don't let us fall into the trap of describing the situation that way, because basically, first and foremost, we're not in charge, and we'll be blamed for some of the mistakes that are being made by the other branch of the government. On the outside, again, the main thing to worry about is Clinton, the comeback kid, despite Whitewater and all that's involved in it. He is a very vigorous and vibrant politician who has been able to bounce back any number of times. He's very adept, obviously, with his middle-class Bill of Rights as one quick example, to steal our rhetoric, to wrap it around his proposals and say mine's really the moderate, sensible way to go, as opposed to what those extremists out there are trying to do, and the next thing you know, it gets kind of fuzzed up, and the media establishment then has a new thing to rally around, to get behind. Don't underestimate him, and remember that there still are basic fundamental differences between us and them. I said just very briefly, last word, I've just returned from a very quick trip to Korea, where I had the honor of meeting both with the President and the Prime Minister over the last 2 days. And the interesting thing from that meeting was not just the concern they're expressing right now about the North Korean nuclear deal which is obviously going to be one of the first real foreign policy challenges that are going to be confronted in the new Congress as it comes up, but also the very diplomatically implied but very real confusion about what U.S. policy is all about. The one anchor really in that part of the world of our foreign policy now for 40 years has been the U.S.-Korean alliance and relationship. Basically what we did in Geneva over the course of the last 18 months was to freeze South Korea out of the negotiations, out of the debate over North Korea and which way we were going to go. They feel left out. They feel that their interests have been slighted. They don't come right out and say that. But the reason I stress this point right now is that it's an easy time for some of our new friends in both the House and Senate who've just been elected who might say, well, we've got enough problems here at home, let's worry about that, let's not get ourselves involved, or let's not even think about those kinds of overseas issues. The fact is, America is still very much the only real superpower left in the world, and the world is still very much a very dangerous place. Our interests are worldwide. That doesn't mean we should be involved in a Somalia or a Haiti, but it does mean that we have to have a clear and predictable policy, which we don't have right now. And I hope that the new members of the House and Senate both will take that role very seriously in terms of helping the administration try to define what that new role ought to be. The District of Columbia for many years was, for all of us conservatives, really a vast wasteland. People like Ben Blackburn, who served up there in the minority for so many years, and Mac Mattingly with their kind of fingers in the dike, just trying to hold back the deluge from coming in and swamping us all. It's a new time, it's a new era. You in Georgia have much to be proud of, not only in all the new members of your delegation who were real stars at our new members conference up in Baltimore, and not only, of course, in the Speaker, but also in one of the real unsung heroes of Washington these days, and that's Paul Coverdell. And if anybody had told me that I would have said that 2 years ago, I would not have thought so, because I knew him when he was at the Peace Corps. But boy, he is rock solid. He's good on the issues. He's very sensible, low-key, but very vigorous in terms of pursuing the right policies, and he's somebody that all of his colleagues in the Senate listen to very carefully as well. It's an exciting time to be able to work together. Again, I commend all of you for your interest in the Georgia Public Policy Foundation and what you are doing here at the state level. We hope we can be of help in some ways from the feds, and in the meantime, let's get on with the job. Thank you very much. Good. You're going to yield? Okay. Who's?
Go ahead, Nate. All right. I think the United States, whether we like it or not, or want it or not, we're in a global economy. My business is domestic, so I don't speak with a special interest. I speak only from the general interest. I think we're going to have to compete or die. One of the most counterproductive things is the income tax. It ought to be abolished and some sort of other tax to generate revenue for the government. I don't think that's going to happen right away, but it looks like the next best alternative is Dick Armey's 17% flat tax idea. What are your views on that in terms of the merits of that program and the viability of it getting passed, and what can we do if we should to help it get passed?
I think in the 6 months ago, when we were talking to Armey about the concept, when he was on the verge of introducing it, about the time we took this picture, which is March, we thought, well, maybe we can at least maybe start a debate in 95 and 96 and make some of the presidential candidates at least start talking about it by 96, and then maybe we'll make some progress, and who knows, by the year 2000 something might happen. Well, the whole timetable is compressed, Amos. It's very exciting to be there, to be part of it, to be able to take some of our staff people to devote the time to sit down with Army's people who are very good. And of course, Army himself is a PhD in economics and really knows the issue inside and out. He was the vice chairman of the Joint Economic Committee. He's looked at it. It's absolutely, we think, the way to go. It's going to get a serious hearing at least this year. I hope it will become a major question for all the presidential candidates in 1996, and I would think, assuming that we keep moving with the same political momentum in the right direction, we could very well be there much more quickly than I would have dared hope 6 months ago. And you're absolutely right. And to my conservative friends, and I've got a lot of them who disagree and who say, no, what we really ought to be doing is moving toward a VAT or a consumption-based tax or something like that. I disagree very profoundly, and the reason I do is a very simple one. Yes, it's more efficient as a tax collector. Yes, it's taxing the right thing in terms of taxing consumption rather than savings, and it's from savings that you get investment, and it's that way that you grow jobs, et cetera. But the problem with a VAT, or a consumption-based tax, is that it's a hidden tax. And I believe, quite frankly, the taxes ought to be visible, and they ought to be painful, and people ought to know they're paying them in order to make sure that people are not being taxed more than they should be, so that they don't end up blaming your companies for suddenly increasing prices when, in fact, what's happened is the VAT rate has just gone up.
To follow up on that, some of the details are very fuzzy to me. The press has reported that the no income tax at all for a family of four under $36,000, I believe it is. But what's not clear to me is what happens to interest income and dividend income and capital gains and estate taxes. Is the tax eliminated there, or?
Certainly on estate taxes, it's eliminated. In terms of capital gains tax, of course, our first objective is to cut it in half, hopefully this year as part of the contract. Maybe the ultimate objective of the capital gains tax, since it's really a double taxation, I would think, would be to eliminate it. That's probably a ways away. The other provisions of what a flat tax would look like are still very much in the hammering out stage at this point.
One last follow-up. What about from the corporate tax standpoint? How does
Well, the Army plan specifically only addresses personal rates.
corporate not involved?
Corporate's not involved.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I'm a physician. I've been very interested in the healthcare reform. I really haven't heard my view on that, the spouse care out. And I kind of look at healthcare reform the same thing as just getting a haircut. When you go to the barber, speaker service, it's unreimbursed out of pocket. And I want everything in healthcare reform to allow people to do this without a tax penalty. When you go to the bar, when you think about it, you get choice, affordability, and quality. And it's the same exact thing that medicine should be. People should have a choice what bar they go to, the cost, they just look to see what the barber prices are, and quality, they get to pick which barber they want. They get a bad haircut, they can go somewhere else. In other words, they judge quality, and so much of the quality today in medical care is being somebody else rather than the patient judging that.
Mm-hmm.
So, I feel the tax incentives now lure the patients over to employer-based care. And what I want to see is more of a really focus in upon what we all know is, at least I know, is the proper way, and that's for people to pay themselves without any tax penalty. Everything should be geared towards that, I feel, in healthcare reform. And that should be the number one priority of any organization that believes in individual freedom, which I think, we talked about the last election being less government. Corollary is individual freedom. I prefer to think more like Thomas Jefferson did. That's the key to this election. And so is there any hope that maybe we can move this healthcare debate to my number one priority, and that's unreimbursed fee-for-service medical care without a tax penalty?
I think, as you know, Doctor, the Nichols-Stearns program, an alternative bill which had more co-sponsors actually than any other bill, save for the Clinton bill itself last time, would have moved exactly in that direction. Our own belief is fundamentally what you have to do is de-link health care from the place of employment, make it deductible for everybody on an equal basis. For people below a certain level, you work in the right kind of tax incentives in order to make them able to give them the ability to afford it. I think what is being looked, and one of the things from your conversations with my colleague Bob Moffett, I'm sure he said, is that we don't want health care to disappear from the radar screen. We want it to be there because we would like to come up with a sensible, meaningful health care reform bill that goes the right way and that is done with due deliberate consideration rather than in the kind of crisis environment that we were in 1993-94. There are some areas, I think, where a kind of a scaled-back version could be put together in terms of combining a super IRA type savings plan for health care costs, making policies portable ought to be something that everybody, liberals and conservatives, agree on. And as soon as you come in with the portability factor, then the deductibility of the cost of the premium will presumably go with it. So,
We're focusing on the premium and portability that way. What I want to focus on is like the haircut. And why make it that complicated? Why not focus in just on unreimbursed fee for service? Because see, really, when you're talking about the heritage program, it doesn't focus on that. You focus more on premium than on the out-of-pocket.
I hear the points you're making, and I will go back with my colleagues and kick it around further.
Thank you.
I think that the Achilles heel to all of this that's going on this past election and everything are the entitlement-driven budget deficits and entitlement-driven budget period. And we hear over and over again that Social Security can't be on the table, and to a lesser extent, Medicare can't be on the table. My question is, has the Heritage Foundation looked at, or is it planning to look at anything in either of those areas that would be more in the nature of capital accumulating systems instead of intergenerational transfer systems? Because I don't think we're ever going to get a grip on the budget as long as we have what we have today.
One of the neat things about being in the public policy arena in Washington for enough years is that any of these arguments that come up are ones that we've looked at in the past, so you just go over to the shelf, dust something off, update the numbers, and do it all over again. And Ben, I think you'd already left the House. Mac, you were probably in the Senate at the time, but this was like 81 or 82. Bob Michael had me over to meet with a group of Republican members in one of his breakfast meetings and said to the effect that what Heritage, I went through Heritage's agenda for 82 or 83, whatever year it was, and I said, and one of the things we're doing over a long term is looking at how to revise the Social Security system. Michael immediately got up, didn't even let me finish my speech, and said, Ed, you may continue to do anything you want with regard to Social Security, just don't get us involved in it at all. We don't want to hear about it. Just come out and do whatever you want, because that's something we're just not going to touch, period. Well, the fact that today, again, the debate has moved so far that people can at least stand around and talk about Social Security being off the table and then go on and say, but there has to be something because we know this crisis is going to be hitting us, means that, in fact, it really is on the table in terms of the first stages of the public policy debate, which is where groups like ours come into play. That doesn't mean that there's going to be a congressman or senator up there right away who's going to be able to call for a Chilean-type reform of privatization, of guaranteeing benefits to basically everybody who's got them now. Don't get nervous, Blackburn. And then at the same time, and at the same time, giving people, younger people, even younger than me, the option to go for private, as you say, capital accumulating systems as opposed to tax systems the way they have it now. The bottom line is, yes, that has to be on the table. Yes, we have to be looking at it. And I think within 3 or 4 years, as the intellectual debate starts, as the ideas start percolating that, hey, this needn't adversely impact either on people who are currently there or on people coming through the job stream in the future. It will be on the table. It will be looked at. And you're absolutely right. It has to be. And so, in fact, we are going to start again revisit the whole subject.
My question really had more to do with symbolism and substance, in the sense I'm not talking about a nuclear war career or something, but it really upsets me as a citizen when I read about the Smithsonian Institute putting on an exhibit about World War II, where they talk about how the Japanese kamikaze pilots were motivated by altruism and the Americans were all motivated by brutish revenge instincts and things of that sort. Is there anything that your group can do to turn those things around? It's obvious that some pretty foreign thinkers have gotten in positions of influence in some of our national institutions. Now, can we do anything to root those people out?
Well, as you know, the whole politically correctness movement has its manifestations in 100 different ways, ranging from this new high school curriculum program, you know, where the Mayan Indians are this model of cooperative society, you know, put aside the fact they had slavery and a few other little problems like that. The problem at the Smithsonian specifically, of course, is some bad appointments that were made there, and those appointments basically fall back to the president. Presumably, a Senate in our hands will look more carefully at those appointments as they come down the pike. On a related matter, and there are some kind of reverberations through the system again in terms of kind of reflecting the new reality. I note where the Corporation for Public Broadcasting just approved a $250,000 grant to the very conservative columnist Don Lambro to do a special, a PBS special on the first 100 days. Now somehow I don't think that would have happened if Gingrich were still the minority leader. Or as one of my friends said, the week after our new members conference, he called me from Denver. He said, "Ed, I just heard you interviewed on National Public Radio, and they really did a fair job." Oh, I wonder why. All of a sudden, NPR is getting nervous. I think there are some indications both that they're going to start acting a little bit more responsively, hopefully not so responsively that we forget that our real objective is to cut them out instead of just getting a fair airing from them. The Smithsonian thing just is disgusting. It's the only word I can use for it.
I'd say one thing about all the issues that have been brought up, the main thing I think the message to take back is make sure that they stay focused on the contract. So we can't overload the circuits. I mean, even though we've got great ideas about how to go in and do this or do that, the main thing is to keep focused, I think, on this agenda.
Amen.
And not get deterred from it. If we can succeed on that, or whatever percent that we can succeed on, then we can take on these other things. I think we're going to show success to the voters in this respect.
I think you're absolutely right, and the more focused they stayed and the more progress they make on the contract, what I really believe is that, in effect, circumventing the White House, but directly with the American people, they can kind of develop a rolling honeymoon where more and more changes continually will be possible because the American people will say, hey, this is the direction we really want to go. You're absolutely right. Last one.
I want to go back to the first question that Amos asked, actually, and I've thought about the taxation now seriously for 6 or 8 or maybe 40 years, I don't know. But the first thing that I'd recommend or talked about was to fire everyone at the Internal Revenue Service. And then, of course, you have to cancel the income tax. But that gets to the question about the use tax, and I didn't understand when you said it was a hidden tax, because you see that at the cash register every time you buy an item. And maybe I'm off base because I only have an undergraduate degree in economics, not a doctorate, but I think that would be a visible thing for the entire country, that every time they walked in to buy something, they saw what their taxes were added on top of it. And it would also help in the international area because the cost of our manufacturing process and manufactured good would be lowered by 30 to 35%.
If in fact a use tax or a national sales tax were administered that way, you would answer a lot of my objections to it. The fact is, as you know, if you travel around Europe and you see something in London priced at £13.95, you go in and you pay $13.95, or you pay 14 and you get 5 pence back, and you never think of the fact that in fact 21% of that is the value-added tax, because it's all there, it's all stated in the one price, and there is no X percent added on at the end, which is what I meant by it being a hidden tax. If there are ways, and if in fact the legislature were to do it in such a way that it is out there in public, just one of my small, modest little reforms that I've advocated in private meetings with the heads of virtually all the major oil companies over the last 10 or 15 years is just post a notice on your pump of the $1.35 for 92 octane, for a gallon of 92 octane. X cents goes to the federal government and Y cents goes to the state, and let people know how much of it actually ends up with Mobil or Texaco or Shell. But you don't know that. Maybe somebody's taking my advice finally. Thank you.